Hello and welcome to the Diverse Bookshelf with me, Samia Aziz. On this show, I interview incredible authors doing a deep dive into important themes and issues while talking all things books. On today's episode, I'm talking to the incredible Soraya Chemaly. Soraya Chemaly is an award-winning journalist, essayist, and author whose work appears regularly in national and international media. In her writing, she rigorously and irreverently casts a bright, incisive light on what it means to be a woman in a world built by men. Her narrative skill, careful research, and humour-filled analysis is described by The New Yorker as relentless and revelatory. She brings these skills to bear in a critical examination of the social construction of anger and its effect on women's lives in her first book, Rage Becomes Her, The Power of Women's Anger. Hello, Soraya. Thank you so much for joining me today on the Diverse Bookshelf. How are you doing?
I'm well, thank you. Thank you very much for having me. I'm delighted to be here.
I'm really excited. So I read Rage Becomes Her in 2020, and it was one of those books that I was constantly just screaming, yes, yes, every time I read a few lines, because so much of it resonated. It helped me put into words so many of my own experiences and the experiences of women that I see around the world, and also how I think about the younger generation and children growing up today. So for anyone listening who might not have read your book, how would you describe Rage Becomes Her?
It's a book that really looks at the way our society is organized and thinks about relationships and power in a broad spectrum. So from the personal to the professional to the political. But I use anger to show how socially constructed so many of the things that we think of as natural or naturalized or normal are. It's kind of a Trojan horse. Anger is something that anyone can understand. We all feel anger, but it's just self-evident that our anger is not treated the same way, that we are not all equipped to use it effectively, that there are prohibitions for some people and entitlements for other people. And so I really just use this idea of emotion throughout our lives to look at knowledge, self-expression, relationships of power that are intimate or political, and try and link all of those.
And on emotions, actually, at the beginning of the book, you posed this question that's, what would happen if we degendered emotion?
Right.
And reading that for me was really interesting because, I've always thought about like labor being gendered or clothing being gendered or, domestic work, for example, or certain things. We don't put the same emphasis on gendering emotion.
Which is, to me at least, I mean, I don't know how you feel. You should tell me if you disagree, but it just seems very clear to me that early childhood socialization is significantly about the gendering of emotion. So this is, before people enter more diverse spaces, before we send children into schools, before they start playing sports or encountering families that might be different from their own within families, which tend still to be homogenous, ethnically, racially, economically. Within families, the gendering of emotion is a very powerful force for sex segregation.
Absolutely. And I think the more I thought about it, the more I realized like how major and how huge that really is, and also how early on it starts when we we say things like, well, boys don't cry, and girls, you should behave nicely and smile, and they're all based on emotion, this idea that a girl should be happy all the time and a boy can be angry,
teasing all the
exactly time. And a boy can be angry and mischievous and boys will be boys,
right?
Which I really hate that phrase, but it's kind of, and the more I thought about it, the more I thought that was really really true, and not enough emphasis is being placed on that. And I think conversations are changing a little bit now, but as you said, like, because it starts so early on, within the family setup as well. It's really
Right.
alarming. And I think one of the things that, I mean, you write about and I was thinking about as well is how, like, the worrying impact that it happens on girls, especially because one of the things you talk about is the fact that girls don't express their anger,
Mm-hmm.
and how later on that comes out in really unhealthy ways,
Right.
like disordered eating and mental health problems. And it's almost as if girls are not allowed to demonstrate that anger. And can you just talk a little bit about that?
Sure. I mean, I think that, and I try, each of the chapters in the book roughly moves from one life stage to the next. So I do start with infancy and early childhood and the ways in which adult biases shape our self-conceptions and our relationships and our ability to express ourselves, and how society responds when we do express ourselves. So, and I want to be clear about this. I focus on anger and in early childhood on girls, but I sometimes joke that I could write the exact same book, but write it about boys and sadness. And it would be remarkably similar because, of course, very early on, boys are penalized for showing emotions that we associate with femininity: sadness, fear, anxiety, and even empathy. Some boys are really discouraged from showing kindness because it's not strong, it's a sign of feminine weakness. And that's all super destructive to them as individuals, to relationships, and to our societies. I mean, our societies are materially suffering because adult men with power are unable to express themselves or accept other people expressing themselves with power. So, to go back to girls, though, it's very clear that from infancy, people have these stereotypes and categories that they apply, in which they would much rather depict an angry girl as sad or troubled or anxious than actually angry. And we see as a child, a girl child moves through childhood and into adolescence, that there's a lot of policing of her anger, but in fact, it's also policing of her aggression or her assertiveness. Those three things get conflated, even though they're very, very different. You can be extremely assertive and not angry at all. You can be aggressive and not angry at all. You can be angry and neither assertive nor aggressive, right? But any of those things are sort of dumped into a bucket of anger and then highly discouraged. So in schools, girls are disciplined more for engaging in disruptive language or actions or behaviors, whether that's jokes or interruptions or not holding their hands up. They're told 3 times at least more often to use their nice voices, to wait their turns to speak. There's this other orientation that we're often socialized to internalize, and that other orientation requires us to set aside as a primary consideration our own needs or desires or wants or objectives. Because in fact, anger is super important as a signal emotion, right? It's the emotion that tells us something's wrong, something has to happen, something should change. And we usually feel anger when we perceive threat, right? A threat to our dignity or our safety or our well-being or our interests. And so my main question is, what has happened as a result of our separating that very important and critical emotion that tells us something's wrong from femininity, and instead given it wholesale in this equation to boys and men, who are also then denied the right to feel all those other softer, more feminine feelings. And that's what I mean by the gendering of emotion. And so girls who demonstrate masculine qualities, and I was certainly one of those girls, I was very competitive, very aggressive, they're just shut down for that. And boys, by the same token, who demonstrate those feminine qualities are equally likely to encounter obstacles. And it's not conscious, it's parents who might be worried that their child will be bullied, or, in my case, I grew up in a very sort of Catholic household, very gender stereotypical roles, right? Like there were just things that girls did not do and boys did not do, and that's just the rule. But as we get older, those ideas diffusely move through our institutions, our schools, our workplaces, our social encounters, our intimate relationships. And so I sort of carry that through the book in through adulthood and old age.
I think one of the things that have surfaced for me, I think, with reading your book as well, is that I find it hard in the moment to identify an emotion as being anger.
Right.
Sometimes it takes me a while once I'm no longer angry to realize that actually that was anger, and it comes
Right.
out at the time in different ways, sometimes in
Yes.
silence, sometimes through crying.
Yes.
And I feel often in that moment, not necessarily like a bubbling rage, but like a helplessness.
A powerlessness.
Yeah,
Yes.
exactly.
Because I think that's right.
And I feel like that's not that. I mean, that doesn't feel very fair. It doesn't feel very positive or very healthy in many ways either. And I wonder if you think there's more that we can do to kind of come in tune with understanding that we are angry and how we can really own that.
So I think there's several parts to that. One is many, many, many of us lose the ability to recognize anger because, in fact, we experience being punished or mocked for expressing anger, right? We learn to minimize it. We use trivializing words. We mask it. And in fact, in order to achieve the goals that our anger seeks, we have to take lots of different paths. So for some people, like crying is very common, right? But crying is quite a stereotypical feminine behavior that puts often the other people around us at ease, right? And so it's a different way of communicating that is not as threatening to the people around us. And girls certainly learn that lesson very early. I mean, a little girl who cries is actually rewarded with care and comfort, right? Her anxiety might be abated. But a little girl who is angry, which is considered rude, impolite, wrong, it's just, for some people, it's just, how dare she? What is she doing? That's just a violation, right? She'll quickly learn that she cannot achieve what she needs to achieve by expressing herself in that way. And so a lot of women not just lose the ability to name the emotion, but lose the ability to even know what it feels like in the body. Anger there's a physiological response in anger. You know, your heartbeat maybe goes up, you feel flushed, your heart races because you want to speak, you can't say things. And even that feeling becomes detached from the word anger. And so I think it is important as individuals for us to ground ourselves back in recognizing our own feelings, what's happening in our bodies, name the emotion. It's very hard. I was probably in my 40s when I could actually say, oh, I'm angry. That's what that is. I would say anything other than angry. I would say I'm very sad, or I'm unsettled, or I don't even know what's wrong, or I would be completely silent. Because in fact, while I was trying to think about how I was feeling and not coming to the word anger, I would just not speak because I wasn't clear, and I need to be clear before I speak, right? And so, we'll contort ourselves all kinds of ways. So there's the recognition of the emotion, the labeling of the emotion, and then the making meaning out of it. So what does it mean that I feel anger? Because in fact, anger is an advance emotion. It's not a retreat emotion. It is a very social emotion, because usually when you're angry, you believe change can happen, and you believe that the people around you, who should be probably caring for you in some capacity, should be registering your need and in some way, shape, or form helping you address it. And a lot of the problem that women certainly have as adults is that their anger is a huge risk, because it puts into a very clear light the degree to which they may not have reciprocal relationships, that people that they care for may not actually care in equal measure. They're much if you try and say something to someone, a brother, a spouse, a mother, even, if you say something and their response is to tone police you sound so angry. What a horrible tone of voice. Why are you acting that way? Instead of listening to what you're saying, that's a disappointment. You're trying to impart important information about something that is vital to you, and they just want you to shut up. And that's very disappointing, because the biggest thing that women say they fear when they express anger isn't physical violence, it's mockery. And one of the greatest reasons they say they get angry, which they do more often and in more sustained ways than men, is a lack of reciprocity, when they have to come to terms. And you know what that is? In the end, that's just a power imbalance. And that's why we feel powerlessness, because it actually forces us to recognize that there is power in our intimate lives. There is power in our professional lives. We're more likely to think about it in terms of politics. But in fact, what we need to be doing is recognizing it in terms of our day-to-day interactions with people that are in our intimate circles.
That's really fascinating. And I think as well, we hold back because we can preempt that disappointment that's going to come. So we hold back from saying how we feel or saying what we think about something, because we can assume that the other person isn't going to understand it. And I guess if it happens once or it happens twice, it happens, you may be able to move forward. But I think because it happens repeatedly in so many different places and in so many different ways, it's like just a constant attack, I guess, of this form of disappointment, which is exhausting.
It is exhausting. That's exactly, it is tax. It is a mental, and actually, as I try and show in the book, a material, physical tax, on our health, on our stability, our mental stability, our financial stability, our relationship stability. I mean, if you can't express anger, by which I don't mean a destructive rage, that's a whole other conversation. If you can't express anger, you genuinely probably cannot have an intimate relationship with the person that you're talking to, because it means they can never really accept what's important to you.
Yeah. And I guess coming to that realization is very difficult.
It's very hard, right?
Yeah, of course.
I mean, it's super hard, because we're told our whole lives that we are responsible for maintaining relationships. Women are the nurturers, the comforters. We build social networks. We support everybody emotionally. And so the idea that we would act in a way that damaged those relationships, or put those relationships at risk, or highlighted the tensions in a relationship, it becomes not just a threat to the other person or to the relationship, whether it's professional or personal. It becomes a threat to identity, to our own identities. And so, to express anger in our own self-defense is conflicting for us. It causes us anguish, and that's a very powerful social weapon against our building solidarity in our own interests.
And just on that, in the book, you talk about this idea of being comfortable with being uncomfortable with regards to anger. Can you just talk about that a little bit? Because I love that.
Well, I mean, I think that's what we were just talking about, right? I mean, our anger makes us uncomfortable very often, right? I mean, it's very interesting. Different countries, even different regions in different countries, have different emotional cultures. And so, for example, I couldn't find there wasn't a lot of research on women's anger, and there was virtually no research on intersectional kind of perspectives on women's anger, right? So it was very hard to come across in-depth longitudinal research about non-binary people and trans women or lesbian women, right? It's just hard to get that. There was some cross-country research, which was very interesting. So in the United States, for example, women report very high levels of shame when they feel anger. Shame's interesting, right? Because shame isn't a matter of having done something wrong, which is what men feel. They feel guilt. Shame means you are wrong. There's something in you that is wrong, right? That's a very different thing. But in Germany, German women express no shame. They feel no shame when they're angry. That's really interesting, right? Like, what
does it say what they feel? Do they feel like?
I would have to go back and look because it's been 4 or 5 years since I did that initial research. It's in the book, but I just remember that difference. I was like,
yeah, that's really fascinating. Yeah,
it's really fascinating, right?
Yeah.
And so, and also different country cultures use anger in different ways. So in some countries, anger is used as a function of leadership, almost always by men, because anger in men confirms people's stereotypes about male power. So it actually helps them develop support for their leadership, whereas anger in a woman undermines our stereotypes about women. So it undermines our faith in a woman leader. And actually, part of the reason I really came to write this book when I did was just frankly how appalled I was watching the build up to the 2016 election and the disparate treatment of men and women candidates. And then in the end, it was Bernie Sanders, Donald Trump, and Hillary Clinton. And both Sanders and Trump, polar opposites politically, could both leverage our comfort with male anger to appeal to populist rage and to demonstrate their own anger and to act in sort of forceful ways when they spoke. But that was simply not available to Hillary Clinton. The double bind of her having to stay calm and unruffled and not appear emotional, which they had no, I mean, those two men are, they're just emotional bomb after emotional bomb. They just, if they were women, we would just say they looked unhinged all the time. But she had to stay coiffed and calm, and for which she was then called inauthentic.
And that's interesting, actually, because, and especially for Donald Trump, because it became part of this caricature, and he, when he would like throw the microphones off the podium, or he'd like be violent towards a cameraman, and it just became a thing like, oh well, there he goes again, there's Trump. And usually it just became like we weren't even flinching at it anymore, which is just so bizarre to think about. He who became president, bizarre.
And I mean, even now with the January 6th hearings, it's very clear that he was, I want to use the word emotionally incontinent, right? He just literally repeatedly falling into fits of rage or anguish and the idea, like the massive entitlement that represents in terms of people treating you with respect or listening to you. I mean, I'm just trying to think, there are very few women that could even get close to the office, and certainly not women that acted that way ever, and you think about Kamala Harris. Can you imagine a Southeast Asian Black woman doing anything that Donald Trump did in terms of expressing herself? It's just laughable, and so I do spend some time in the book explaining the distribution of emotional resources as a form of political entitlement, right? Because emotions are so critical to the way we communicate as humans, and yet they're so severely regulated for that reason, right? And that's why the conversation that I have in the book with readers continuously is think about power, think about power. Think about power at your dinner table. Think about power in your classroom.
I mean, and there is an undeniable link with race as well, because the angry
absolutely.
white man is not the same as the angry Black man,
right?
Or the angry Black woman. It's just not that, and it is a power thing. It's a power thing. It's a control thing. It's racism at the heart of it as well.
Right.
And I think that, like, if Barack Obama had behaved the way that Trump had behaved during his presidential campaign, I don't think he would have ended up president.
No, and one of the funniest sort of satirical ongoing running skits during his pregnancy was Key and Peele's Anger Translator, where one of them pretended to be Obama and the other one, he would stay calm and reserved and, say something in a sort of intellectual way, and then his anger translator would just go to town next to him, And that's very funny, but it's also not, right? Like
Exactly.
the fact is that an angry Black man is so quickly criminalized.
Absolutely.
So it so endangers a Black man to express his anger, and an angry Black woman is criminalized, but also just considered a threat,
Mm.
even if she may not have which I actually think is not the case, but we think of men and we think initially of rage and physical violence, but in the United States at least, a Black woman is also not considered a woman the same way.
Mm.
A Black woman's body has always been much more likely to be seen as more brutish and animal-like and
Yes.
masculine. And
Yes.
so even a Black woman's anger often perceived and represented as a physical threat to those around her
Mm.
in a
I
way
mean,
a white woman's anger isn't.
and I'd go so far as to say a Black woman's anger is used as a way to dehumanize her as well.
Right,
That
right.
we don't see her, or she's not perceived to be a member of society when she's an angry Black woman. It's almost as if her anger makes her not worthy to be considered human, that has basic human rights.
Right. And also, she doesn't even have to be angry to be considered an angry Black woman, right? I mean, Michelle Obama just had to wake up in the morning and conservative media just went off with the fact that she
Mm.
was angry. And, these stereotypes, they have very tangible and painful outcomes. I mean, we know that in schools, young Black girls are 5 to 10 times in some places more likely, starting in kindergarten, to be disciplined, policed, suspended, expelled, and then as they get older, actually sexually violated and criminalized as part of a pipeline to prison, even, starting at very young ages.
In the book, there's this section which talks about Black women
Hmm.
and kind of like the number of Black women that die during childbirth
Oh,
and
yes.
the really horrifying statistics, which I'm sure post COVID are probably even worse now.
And now with the overturn of Roe v. Wade in the US will get much worse.
Exactly. What was your research process for that like?
Oh my gosh. Well, I've been writing about these things now for almost 15 years. So my
Mm.
research process was rage. My research process was, this is just dumbfounding.
Yeah,
It's
absolutely.
dumbfounding. I'm constantly dumbfounded by the lack of attention, by the lack of care, by the cruelty of the society,
Mm.
by just the sheer ugliness of what it takes to have no societal compassion for
Mm.
people,
Mm.
and so the US is the only nation of its peer nations that has rising maternal mortality rates, and those numbers are driven by the maternal mortality of mainly Black and brown women, but especially Black women,
Mm.
who are anywhere from, I think it's 3 to 6 times as likely to die in childbirth than a white woman. And that's, I use the example of Serena Williams because, my God, this is a prominent, wealthy, famous woman who herself experienced medical discrimination and could have died.
Mm.
And so in the book, I have a chapter that really touches on medical bias and emotion and the attribution emotion in the clinical setting. And so, for example, all over the world, studies show that women wait longer in emergency rooms. They just wait longer than men do. And one of the reasons may actually be because men will they will get angry and they will demand care, particularly white men in societies like the United States. And when they demand care, they get it. If a woman demands care, she's punished for it and made to wait longer if she gets angry in an emergency room, right? That sort of scenario plays out over and over and over again.
Yeah.
If a woman, there was one study, honestly, these things are so terrible, women who need pain relief for knee surgery, for example. There was one study on knee surgery, I think it was, men and women reporting the same levels of pain. Men are given pain relievers and women are given sedatives.
Oh
Now,
my
a
goodness.
sedative doesn't actually alleviate your pain. It just makes you less likely to bother other people by saying you need help.
Mm.
Right. And so, anyway, this chapter was really sort of very much about the body, which was separate from a chapter about imposition of motherhood on all people who are thought of as women, right? Like whether you can bear children or not, if you're feminine, if you're a woman, there are certain societal impositions and expectations. If you abjure that, if you decide I don't want children, you have a whole other range of issues, right? If you can't have children, a whole other range of issues. If you miscarry, a whole other, but it's all just that this idea that if you are female, your primary purpose is to reproduce, you know?
Yeah. I think that plays out in many cultures and many places. I mean, I'd be tempted to say everywhere, and the impact
Yeah, it's hard not to say everywhere.
Exactly. And the impact that has on women is really, really shocking and really frightening. Because I have done some work I work in the development sector, in the international development sector, and I have done some work on maternal care, maternal mortality, and in Pakistan and also in Kenya as well a little bit. And I have seen firsthand how much pain and suffering there is.
It's just brutalizing.
Exactly.
And I mean, if you've done that kind of work, then you know what emergency relief looks like, right? Because emergency relief standards still treat pregnant women, or even girls and women who can be pregnant, as some kind of outlier externality.
Yeah.
You know, to try and get menstrual supplies, for example, in an emergency relief situation, which more than sometimes half the people need, is considered some kind of exceptional demand.
It is.
You know, and or to try and get resources for people who experience sexual assault, which skyrockets during times of crisis and disaster, because there's opportunity for predators, right? They're just going to assault people. But for pregnant women in those situations, for birthing people, it's just horrifying what they have to navigate and encounter. Because I think the way I put it in the book is, we love motherhood, but we're not too keen on actual mothers. You know, we have this ideal of motherhood, and we sort of turn it into this saintly function. But it has really very little to do with the actual pragmatic, practical, material realities of having a body that can bear children.
Absolutely. And I think in my experience, one of the things that I have been the most horrified and shocked by is when we work with refugees, many women in refugee camps are pregnant, especially if they have fled a place of violence where there has been rape taking place as a form of control or whatever, like from Myanmar with the Rohingya refugees. A lot of them, when they came 9 months later, gave birth because of the situations that they went through. But the facilities for them to give birth in these refugee camps are subpar at best. Subpar. And it feels like we don't think about it as an immediate thing. And then so many women that are breastfeeding have issues, and they're not given the right support when they really need to. And it's just, it's really horrifying.
I mean, it's always this idea that a normal human being is an able-bodied man. That's the normal human being. And any deviations from that norm cost too much money, you know, require extra effort. It's always the work around that body.
You talk about it in the book, as well as girls growing up in a man's world. And we see it in institutions and workplaces, even in the UK, in the Houses of Parliament. I think there's like one female toilet for I don't know how many.
Oh, that's a whole other thing.
How many men?
And they're far away. And
Exactly.
I mean, there's, you know, it's just that's a whole other podcast.
In the book, you make distinction between anger, assertiveness, and aggression. Can you and I know you do that in quite a bit of detail in the book, and I think it's really important, and you referred to it earlier on as well, when we think about anger and how so many different things believed or perceived to be anger, but they're just not. Can you talk about that a little bit?
Sure. I mean, I think one of the issues, you know, that's to me, that's related to tone policing. And one of the issues is that I think it's fair to say that our societies are not that interested in women challenging men. And that's a really important thing to remember when we talk about this regulation of emotion. Mm-hmm. Because in fact, the way we perceive or attribute anger has to do with a larger system regulating speech. Mm-hmm. So for example, in legislative settings or corporate settings where you have men and women speaking, if women speak 30% of the time, everyone, men and women, think they're talking too much and dominating the conversation. Mm-hmm. And that's kind of interesting, right? Because in fact, it means we expect women to be more quiet. Mm-hmm. And we have a bias, a listening bias. Recently has actually been super important to consider because of the pandemic and everything moving online into Zooms and classrooms and Zooms. And, you know, there've been some fascinating studies done looking at what happens when girls in classrooms or women in meetings try and speak in these, within the parameter of these technologies even. And the technologies give us an opportunity to actually see the dynamic in a way we didn't before. And actually this startling study of 20 years of recorded conference calls showed that men on calls spoke more than 95% of the time.
Wow. That's a lot.
So if you think about the context of that, and you think again about early childhood, we see the early stages of those speech dynamics being enforced as well. So at a dinner table or a classroom, because of things like boys will be boys and the common misunderstanding that boys cannot control themselves the way girls can, which is simply untrue. It's just like study after study shows that this is just not the case. It's adult perception and bias that leads to those beliefs. Boys are just allowed to interrupt, and they're allowed to tell off-color jokes, and they're allowed to be disruptive because we think of them as rambunctious. But a girl doing that is impolite and is scolded and told not to do it. And so it's within the context of other types of policing behaviors, the conflation of anger, assertiveness, and aggression happens. So a young girl who feels very deeply about a topic or is extremely well informed about a topic, for example, politics, might express herself with clarity and force, and automatically she is categorized as challenging, hostile, rude, aggressive, instead of simply assertively stating her argument and having the knowledge to do it. You know, before you even get to the idea that she might be knowledgeable, there's 6 layers of dismissal of her or policing of her, even with words like passionate, or she's so cute when she's angry, you know, she's so passionate about that topic, as though she cannot both have the power of her feelings and the wisdom and knowledge that she has accrued. Right? And so I always urge parents and teachers, especially with young children, to think about those distinctions, you know, to think about why it is they're so uncomfortable with a forceful girl who is comfortable arguing, is comfortable debating, doesn't back down, might be challenging. You know, we encourage those behaviors in boys because we associate it with leadership and with power.
It's very true. And I went for secondary school.
Yeah.
I went to a girls' school. It only dawned on me when I was in mixed settings, like just how different it was, and how aware I was of how I was coming across.
Right.
But not when I was in the classroom at school. So I used to do debating as part of a debating society, and we did these like inter-school competitions.
Yeah.
And I remember the first one we went to, and I had prepared really well. I was really confident in my team. But then all of a sudden I became aware that there's a boy who he's a boy, and he's gonna make a judgment about me. And I could see like the way that when I would say certain things, like, you know, he would be smirking, and I knew what he was thinking. He's thinking, oh, this is just an angry loud girl.
Right.
And it was just bizarre, because actually, you know, I was just highly intelligent and very articulate, and I was going to win that debate competition.
That's right.
Like,
That's
that's
right.
all it was that was going on. But it was being, you know, being interpreted as like, no, she's aggressive, or she's angry. And
you're making people uncomfortable by demonstrating that you can compete equally and with maybe even superior skill. And
Absolutely.
that makes people extremely uncomfortable.
Absolutely.
That makes people uncomfortable even now. I mean, I'm 56, and I was recently somewhere where, you know, a man just sort of shared his opinions about a topic, and I shared mine back. When I did, I think some people were uncomfortable that I had agreed with him and challenged him, and they were unaware of the degree to which he, in his own expression and his opinions, had made me and many other people uncomfortable. But it didn't matter, because we are expected to absorb the discomfort and put others at ease and not create that discomfort.
Yes. It's absorbing the discomfort that's such a huge issue and such a huge frustration. I've been in like work-related settings where the room is predominantly male, and I've been uncomfortable with the fact that the room is predominantly male due to structural issues within the organization. And when I've raised that issue in front of all these men, it's not been received so well. Because they think that I'm speaking out of turn, or I'm just creating.
Well, they would rather that their
problems.
Masculinity as a privilege not be noted.
The other thing you write about as well is, what do you call it? Benevolent chivalry? Is that what
benevolent sexism.
That's it, benevolent sexism. And it refers to chivalry. And I mean, talk a little bit about that, please, because I thought that was really interesting.
I think most people can recognize hostile sexism. You know, if somebody says, you know, women can't do math and girls are just stupid, and, you know, just the idiocy, whatever it may be, right? But benevolent sexism is a little different, because it's actually expresses itself through the idea that women are better or purer or morally more are responsible for morality, that they deserve protection because they're more vulnerable. And in the pursuit of that framework, men then are supposed to complement that by being stronger and by using their power for good and by protecting women and opening doors is one example, a stupid example, right? What woman cannot open her own door? That's just asinine.
Yeah, agree.
Right? We do not, no woman is going to come to a halt in her day if a man doesn't open a door for her. But the question is, why does it matter, right? Like, I don't care if a man opens a door for me, that's fine. What bothers me is if a man thinks I shouldn't be opening a door for him. Right? Like, that's just ridiculous, you know? And so that's not a very good example, but the benevolent sexism is really another word for sort of a pedestal sexism. You put a woman on a pedestal, and, you know, there's only one place a woman on a pedestal can go, and that's off. You know, she can fall. She'd literally be a fallen woman, you know? And so it's pretty corrosive. It's pretty corrosive to women's well-being and equality. And some of the studies I cite talk about the fact that when women themselves believe in the sex-segregated idea, and it is a sex-segregated idea that you have these complementary but different male and female natural attributes that then structure society in such a way that women are responsible for private life and men for public life, and women for children and men for money. And it, you know, the binaries are quite stark, and I think they're pretty evident, particularly during the time of COVID, to everybody. But, you know, there's nothing natural about those. It's efficient in a capitalist society. You know, there are societies, human societies, where that division of labor doesn't exist. There are human societies where we have throughout history organized ourselves in different ways, you know, and so I just think that being aware of benevolent sexism is important. But what I was saying is women who internalize benevolent sexism are much more likely to self-objectify, to have unhealthy habits related to their mental well-being, and to also undermine themselves, and to think less of their own intelligence, and to think less of their ambition in the workplace.
Or so much that makes us angry, or so much that we feel angry about actually makes us so exhausted. And part of that exhaustion is also like, how do we manage our anger, and how when we're not accepting it and we're not identifying it. So what do we do when we're so exhausted?
So this was really, again, a primary reason I wrote this book, is I wanted to talk about ways in which could recognize what was happening so we wouldn't end up acting in ways that end up hurting us, right? Through poor health, exhaustion, stress, unhappiness, whatever it may be. So I would say a couple of things. It is very hard to ask for help.
Yeah.
It is even harder to demand help, right? It's harder to have consequences for people who don't help when they should be helping. And because it's so complicated and we're so exhausted, we often just walk away. It's easier. I don't know how many times I hear women say, it's just easier if I do it myself. Right?
Yeah.
I kind of laugh because over and over and over again, I'll encounter a group of women and people will say, how are you? And very often, a lot of women in the group will say, my God, I'm so stressed, or I'm so tired, or I just need a drink, right? That's a big out, right? When men get together, they're not saying those things. They may be feeling stressed, but they're definitely not saying, I'm so stressed, I'm so worried, I'm exhausted, I have too much to do. This is not the way conversations go. But women will say these things, but then they'll dismiss them. They'll say, let's have a drink, or it's not that bad, or it could be worse, or, there's so many ways in which we just don't say, I'm not getting enough help from my spouse. Like, look at COVID, right? We know what's happening during COVID. Millions of women leaving the workforce, exhaustion, escalating stress, very big, bright spotlight on domestic inequality. And yet, is behavior changing? I don't really see a lot of behavior changing. There was this big movement in the United States of women going into football fields to scream, and people were like, yeah, they're getting their anger out. So a couple of media outlets called me and said, well, what do you think? Isn't this great? And I'm like, no. Why are they going into fields to scream? Like, why aren't they not in their house, like having it out so that they don't feel this way and have to go to a field to scream? I mean, I just don't understand it. If you can't have those conversations at home, how can you have them at work? Or how can you think about how to change the political realities of society that affect you? And the other thing too is, in households with children, those children have nothing better to do than watch what's happening and learn from it. Every little boy, every little girl in a house today is watching their mothers give up their careers and get exhausted and angry and frustrated and tired. And their fathers take on the stress of being sole wage earner, but also not doing the things their mother. I mean, it's a very clear example. So you can talk a good game, but unless you actually change your behavior, you're just going to reproduce the system that got you in the fucked up place, to begin with.
Absolutely. And that football pitch thing is just the clearest example of literally taking women away from they're like putting them in a far corner and just letting them get it out of their system and then get back to
just take it out. Don't make anybody upset in your house.
Exactly.
Anyway.
Yeah. Well, thank you. I know you have to go. Thank you so much.
Thank you. It was really great to talk to you.
Absolutely brilliant. Thank you so much, Soraya.
Yes. Have a good day. Stay cool.
You too. Bye. Thank you so much to Soraya for her time, wisdom, and such an insightful and empowering conversation. If you enjoyed this podcast, please follow the Diverse Bookshelf on your podcast platform of choice and connect with me on social media.